Oh, hello. My name is Patrick, and this is Prep Mindful, your daily video practice in mindful test prep. And today I'd like to talk a little bit about a framework that I use with my students to help bring a little bit of clarity when it comes to the repetitive slog of preparing for standardized tests. And it's called the two gaps. I don't know about you, but when I was in school and I would get a test back and see that red mark and discover that I had answered a question incorrectly, mostly my reaction would be, fuck. But that was about as far as it went. I didn't usually pore over my test and think, all right, what went wrong here? How can I improve for next time? Because I had other things to do. I had another class to go to. I had my extracurriculars, etc. I mostly just hoped that whatever thing was confusing me wouldn't appear too many times on the final. But when you're preparing for the ACT or SAT or really any standardized test, you can afford to be a bit more nuanced in your analysis of why you get questions wrong, because you're going to be doing the same kind of thing over and over again. And that's where the two gaps comes in. Okay? Now here's the way to picture it. You have a post here, and then a gap, who would have thought, and then a post in the middle, and a post all the way down at the end. And to the left, it continues on infinitely, but it ends right there on the right. Now, what does this horrible fence mean? Let's start here at the left post, okay? You are here. And what that means is if I were to give you a test right now, this is about the score that you would achieve. It's probably around the same as the score you would have achieved last week if I had given you a test then, which I didn't. But this represents how you're scoring on the test, right? It's not the lowest that you could possibly score, and that's why there's this infinite expanse to the left, but that's where you're at, okay? Now, this middle post is something like your current potential, and that is, what would your score be if you were to answer correctly every question that you are capable of answering correctly? My wager is that that would be a little bit higher than where your score is right now. And this post all the way to the right is a perfect score. And the reason why the line doesn't continue past that is because that's the end of the game. Why don't we think about these gaps one at a time? So this first gap, between where you're scoring and what your current potential is. What would be the reason for that gap to exist? What sorts of things would fill it? Well, the most common error that students make on these tests is misreading, right? If you read a question and then answer a different question from the one that was being asked, it's pretty hard for you to get it right. And that could be misreading the question, misreading the answer choices, misreading the passage, any part of that, misreading. General sloppiness when it comes to line-by-line math work, entering things in our calculator incorrectly, sort of a bummer. Running out of time, right? A lot of students complain about being rushed on these tests, and if you don't get to a question, then it wasn't within your current potential to get it right, because you didn't even get to read it. And the last and probably most tragic of the errors that fall into this gap is misbubbling, which is such a bummer. It just it sucks. Anyway, then we have the gap to the right? Which would be what separates our current potential from a perfect score. Well, why would you not currently be able to answer a question correctly? And these would be things like grammar rules, little who versus whom action, more complicated math concepts, or even math concepts that were introduced to us in middle school and that we're a little rusty about. For a lot of students, that's geometry. There could be gaps in our vocabulary. If you're not sure what one of the words means within a question, it's pretty hard to get it right. And so these are the types of things that keep our current potential from being a perfect score. When you answer a question incorrectly and you're looking back and reviewing and you mourn the mistake that might have been made, it can be helpful to place that error into one of these two gaps. Because let's look at this gap on the left. We're talking about misreading, misbubbling, being sloppy, running out of time. All of these gaps are addressed by something like technique, how you are approaching the test. And your technique is made up of habits. Right now, you have hundreds of test-taking habits, from where on your desk you put the test booklet, to how fast you read, to when you bubble, whether you cross off answer choices, what you underline within a question, what kind of notes you take next to a question, how often you use your calculator, how often you check the clock, all sorts of things like that. And those habits all amount to your test-taking technique. And it's these shortcomings in technique that keep you from fulfilling your current potential. And then if you look at this second gap, which separates your current potential from a perfect score, well, that gap is filled in by something more like knowledge, right? Things that you know and different ideas that you've been exposed to. Well, when you get a question wrong, it can fall into one of these two gaps. And the reason why you want to classify it is because the way that you address these two different kinds of shortcomings are drastically different, right? An error in technique means that we need to adjust our habits. We need to work on intentional practice and changing the way that we approach this type of question. If there's an error in knowledge, well then like, damn, but that just means you get to learn some stuff. And it can be annoying, right? It's not always the most fascinating thing in the world to think again about isosceles triangles. But it's clear that the way you would address that is by practicing problems of that specific type and honing in on what are the concepts that I need to have a firmer grasp on. If you get a question wrong because that's some shit you didn't know, well then that's no tragedy, right? That just means your area of improvement is quite clear. But if you get a question wrong because you misread the question, well, hold up, right? We need to take a step back. We need to figure out what are the kinds of habits that I'm going to build up that will prevent this kind of thing from happening in the future, which can be doing more underlining of keywords or crossing off answer choices or using our hands and test papers to make it so that we're only considering one answer choice at a time. The other thing to consider around the two gaps is this. As long as the first gap exists, meaning as long as knowing how to get a question right doesn't necessarily mean that you get it right, well, then I would argue that it doesn't really matter how much you know. Because if having the knowledge doesn't always translate into correct answer choices, well, then you'd be wasting your time just pouring in more knowledge and more arcane vocabulary and complicated math concepts, when at the end of the day, we're just too sloppy to get correct answers. So in the beginning, our focus is on our technique. Because once you've eliminated this first gap, or come as close to that as possible, all the rest of the second gap is just a party. All right, cool, we'll learn some stuff. That might actually be enjoyable, I swear. So the two gaps is a framework of thinking about your own progress. Of course, it's annoying to make mistakes, but what's even more annoying is not knowing why and not drafting up specific solutions to make sure that those mistakes don't repeat themselves. So I recommend taking on the two gaps. And when you're reviewing a problem or even a full section that you did and seeing the incorrect answers that came out, it's just adjusting, okay, was this a first gap issue or a second gap issue? The more you know, right? In any case, it'll only help to take on this tool, which is designed to make your improvement more efficient, right? So that you're not just randomly improving at different things, but you're addressing and diagnosing specifically, what am I doing wrong? Is it technique? Is it knowledge? And then you can take a path towards improvement that has a lot fewer missteps. And so those are the two gaps. And if for some reason you're watching this video and you're not in the midst of a standardized test prep situation, well then go nuts and use the two gaps to think about improvement at any skill. Still works. Anyway, thanks for taking the time. My name is Patrick, and this has been Prep Mindful.